The kind of town where everybody knows which car belongs in which driveway, and if something changes, somebody's already talking about it before you pulled back out onto the main road. I grew up in Mill Haven, Ohio, small enough that the grocery store on Delaney Street still had a bulletin board with index cards pinned to it. Big enough that you could go a whole winter without running into someone you didn't want to see, if you were careful. I was always careful. My name is not important. What I am is 56 years old, and I work with my hands. I always have. My younger brother, Russ, never let me forget it. Russ is 4 years younger than me. We grew up in the same house, ate the same cereal, shared the same bedroom until he was 12 and I was 16, and our parents finally converted the garage into a room for me. Best thing that ever happened to me, honestly. I got a space to think. Russ got the whole bedroom to himself, which he always thought he deserved anyway. Even as a kid, he had this way of standing with his feet apart and his chin up, like he was waiting for someone to challenge him. Nobody usually did. He was charming when he needed to be, and cutting when he wasn't. The combination worked well for him socially, not so well for anyone who lived with him. He went to Ohio State. I went to work. I didn't go to work because I couldn't afford college, though money was tight. I went to work because I found something I was good at, and when you find that at 19, you follow it. I got certified as an HVAC technician, got hired on with a company in Columbus, learned everything I could. By the time I was 25, I knew more about commercial refrigeration systems than men twice my age. Russ graduated with a business degree and went into commercial real estate. He was good at it for a while. He had the handshake, the blazer, the vocabulary that made people feel like they were in capable hands. He bought a house in a suburb north of Columbus. He married a woman named Patrice. No, wait. Her name was Lynette. Tall, sharp-tongued, liked to laugh at things that weren't quite funny. They had 2 kids, both boys, both loud. I didn't marry young. I had reasons for that, which I'll get to. What I did do, quietly and without announcing it to anyone, was build something. The first time I remember Russ making a comment about my life, I was 28. We were at our parents' house for the 4th of July. Our dad was still alive then, still grilling hot dogs on the back deck, still wearing that ridiculous apron that said, "Grill Cernit." Our mom was inside with a potato salad, the radio on, her white sneakers on the linoleum. Russ walked over to where I was standing by the fence and looked me up and down. I'd driven up in my work truck. I hadn't thought to swap vehicles. He said, "Still doing the AC thing, huh?" I said yes. He said, "Good for you. Steady work." The way he said steady, like it was a consolation prize, like I'd entered a race and finished somewhere in the middle and he was being generous about it. I didn't say anything. I turned back toward the yard. My dad caught my eye from across the deck and gave me a small nod. He knew Russ. He'd been managing Russ his whole life. That was the first time. It wasn't the last. By the time I was in my mid-30s, I had started my own company, Cascade Climate Solutions. We did commercial HVAC installation and service contracts, office buildings, cold storage facilities, industrial plants. I had 6 employees in year 2, 14 by year 5. The work was unglamorous. It involved a lot of early mornings and a lot of crawl spaces and a lot of phone calls at 11 at night. Because some restaurants' walk-in cooler had gone down and they were losing a week's worth of inventory. I loved it. I never talked about it at family events. Part of that was personality. I've never been someone who announces things. Part of it was that I learned early on that when you tell Russ something good about your life, he finds a way to shrink it. So I stopped handing him material. My parents knew I was doing okay. They didn't know the details, and I preferred it that way. What nobody in my family knew, not my mother, not my aunts and uncles, not my cousins who showed up every Thanksgiving with their casseroles and their updates about their kids' soccer teams, was that I had met someone. Her name was Carly. I met her at a trade conference in Cincinnati when I was 34. She was there representing a commercial refrigeration manufacturer out of Louisville. She had dark hair she kept pulled back and a way of listening to people that made them feel like what they were saying mattered. She was not loud. She was not performing. She was just herself, completely and without apology, and I had never met anyone like her. We got married in a small ceremony in Louisville 2 years later. Her family was there. My parents were there. A few close friends. We had it at a garden venue on a Saturday in October, and it rained for about 10 minutes at the exact wrong moment and then stopped, and we all stood there in the wet grass and laughed about it. I did not tell Russ. I know how that sounds. I've had years to think about it, and I'll try to explain it as honestly as I can. Russ had spent the better part of a decade treating my life like a cautionary tale he was glad he'd avoided. When things with Carolee became serious, something in me just decided this was mine. This was not going to be handed to him to assess and comment on and measure against his own life. Carolee understood. She was a private person herself. Her feeling was that if my family came around, they'd meet her eventually. If they didn't, that was information too. We had a daughter, May, 18 months after we married. Then a son, Tucker, 3 years after that. Nobody in my family, not my extended family, not my cousins, not my aunts, knew any of this. Life gets busy. Years go by. You stop waiting for the right moment, and the right moment stops existing. Our family did Thanksgiving at our Aunt Vera's house in Mill Haven every year. She lived in the same house she'd bought in 1981. A 2-story colonial on the north end of town with a kitchen that smelled permanently of coffee and old wood. She made the kind of Thanksgiving where the food was done by noon and nobody ate until 3, and everyone just kind of floated around the house talking at each other. I came every year. Alone, which everyone accepted because they'd long since categorized me as the quiet one, the bachelor, the one who worked too much. Carolee and the kids went to her family in Louisville for Thanksgiving. That was her tradition, and it made sense. I drove to Millhaven, spent the day, drove home. The year I turned 54, Russ was going through some things. He'd had 2 or 3 deals fall through in the real estate market. The commercial sector had softened, and he'd bet on a couple of properties that didn't pay off the way he projected. I didn't know the extent of it at the time. I just knew he'd been quieter than usual for most of the year, which with Russ usually meant something was wrong that he didn't want to admit yet. At Thanksgiving that year, he found his way back to himself. That's the best way I can put it. He'd had a couple glasses of whatever my uncle was pouring, and the room was full and warm, and he had an audience, and Russ always expanded when he had an audience. I was standing near the bookshelf in the living room, eating a piece of my aunt's cornbread, not talking to anyone in particular, watching the room the way I usually do. Vera was on the couch with her friend from church. My cousins were in the kitchen. The football game was on with the sound low. Russ came and stood next to me. Not because he wanted to talk to me, I don't think. Because I was a convenient surface to bounce himself off. He said, "You know what I was thinking about the other day?" I said I didn't. He said he was thinking about how different our lives turned out. How he'd always figured I'd be the one who went to college, got the career, the whole thing. He said he meant that as a compliment, by the way. He was smiling when he said it. That particular smile of his that holds a blade behind it. I ate my cornbread. He said, "I just think about where we are now, 54 or 50. And you're still doing what service calls, crawling around in attics?" I said I ran a company. He said, Right. You've got a few guys working for you, I remember. That's great, man. That's solid." He nodded like he was approving something. "It's just, I don't know. You've been doing the same thing for 30 years. You ever think about where you'd be if you'd pushed yourself a little more? Taken some risks?" He paused. He said, "No wife, no kids. At this point, you're kind of just maintaining, right? Getting to retirement. That's not a bad life. That's just not the life I would have chosen." He said it pleasantly. That was the thing about Russ. He could say things like that and make them sound like concern. My Aunt Vera was across the room. She looked up and caught my eye for half a second. She'd heard enough of it, I could tell. I didn't respond. I nodded once, finished my cornbread, and went to get some water from the kitchen. The drive back to Columbus that night took about 40 minutes. I put on the radio and didn't think too hard about anything. I called Carolee when I got home. She asked how it went. I said fine. She asked if Russ had said anything. I said the usual. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "One of these days, you're going to have to decide how long you want to keep that particular game going." She wasn't telling me what to do. That wasn't her style. She was just noting what she saw. May was 12 at the time. Tucker was 9. They knew I had a brother. They'd never met him. 8 months later, Russ called me on a Wednesday morning. I was at my desk going over a bid for a warehouse project in Dayton when my cell rang and his name came up. He never called on weekdays. He didn't call on weekends much either. We weren't a phone call kind of family. We were a show up at Thanksgiving and tolerate each other kind of family. I ticked up. He said hi, said he was checking in, asked how things were going. Small talk, which Russ wasn't usually interested in. I answered carefully. There was something underneath the call. I could feel it, The way you feel weather coming. After about 3 minutes of talking about nothing, he said, "Hey, I'm going to be straight with you." I said, "Okay." He said he was in a difficult spot. He had a deal, a big one, commercial property outside Cleveland, that was supposed to close in 30 days. He'd taken on a partner who'd backed out last minute, left him holding the financing gap. He needed to cover around $40,000 to keep the deal from falling apart. He'd been to his bank. He'd called 2 investors he knew. He was running out of time and running out of options. He needed a bridge loan. He was asking me. I let a moment pass. I asked him when he needed to know by. He said, ideally, by end of week. I told him I'd call him back. I hung up and sat at my desk for a while. The bid for the Dayton warehouse was still open on my computer. I closed it and looked out the window for a minute. $40,000 was not a large number for my business. We had a line of credit through Huntington Bank with 20 times that capacity. Cascade had done just under $4 million in revenue the previous year. I had a full-time office manager, an accountant, a fleet of 8 trucks, and a service team that covered most of central and southern Ohio. Russ didn't know any of that. Not the revenue, not the employees, not the contracts, none of it. He called me because he thought I was a guy with a few workers in a pickup truck, and $40,000 was probably a stretch, but maybe I'd have it in savings somewhere. I sat there and thought about Thanksgiving, about the cornbread, about the smile he'd had when he said, "That's just not the life I would have chosen." I called my accountant. We talked through the structure. If I was going to do this, I was going to do it right. I called Russ back that Friday. I told him I could help, but not the way he was asking. I wasn't going to hand him $40,000 as a personal loan on a handshake. What I was willing to do was come in as a documented creditor on the deal, proper paperwork, interest rate, repayment schedule, and I wanted to see the full financials on the property before I committed to anything. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "You have $40,000 just available." I told him I had the financials or I had nothing. He sent them over by Sunday. I had my accountant review everything. The deal was legitimate, risky but not stupid. The property had real upside if the market held. I told Russ I'd do it. He drove down to Columbus on a Tuesday to sign the paperwork. He walked into my office and stopped. My office is on the 3rd floor of a building I own on the east side of Columbus. The lobby has a reception desk. My name is on the door in brushed nickel letters. The conference room has a window that looks out over a parking lot full of Cascade trucks. He stood in the doorway and looked at it. He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "When did all this happen?" I said it had been happening for about 20 years. He sat down across from me at the conference table. My office manager brought in coffee without being asked. Russ watched her come and go and then looked back at me. He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I told him the truth. I told him that every time I had something in my life, he found a way to make it smaller. And I got tired of handing him things to shrink. He didn't argue with it. We signed the paperwork. He shook my hand at the door. I noticed he wasn't holding eye contact the way he usually did. He drove home, and I figured that was probably the end of the comfortable version of our relationship. I wasn't wrong, exactly. But it wasn't the end of everything. 2 weeks later, he called again. Not about the deal, just to talk. He asked if I'd ever wanted to say anything back all those years. I said not really. He asked why not. I told him I didn't need him to know he was wrong. I already knew. He was quiet for a while. He said, "I've been a pretty terrible brother." I didn't disagree, but I also didn't pile on. There wasn't anything to gain from that. I said, "The deal closes, you pay me back on schedule, we move forward." That was all I needed to say. In November of that year, I brought Carolee and the kids to Thanksgiving at Aunt Vera's. I should describe the moment better than I probably can. We walked in, me, Carolee with her coat still on, May carrying a pie she'd made herself, Tucker already looking for the TV, and the room just went still. My aunt put down her dish towel. My cousins turned from the kitchen counter. Russ was standing by the window. He looked at Carolee and at May and at Tucker and then at me. And he didn't say anything for a long time. Aunt Vera crossed the room and took Carolee's hands and said, "Well, it is so good to finally meet you." And her voice had that particular softness it gets when she's genuinely moved, and she pulled her into a hug like she'd known her for years. May stood beside me and leaned into my arm a little. She was 13 by then. She'd been nervous on the drive up. I told her Aunt Vera was going to love her immediately. I was right. Tucker found the TV inside of 90 seconds. Russ and I stood near each other for a while without talking. Eventually he said, "She's great," meaning Carolee. I said I knew. He said, "Your kids are good looking." I said I knew that too. He laughed a little, not the sharp laugh he usually had, something lower, quieter. He said, "I missed a lot." I said, "You made choices, I made choices. Here we are." The deal in Cleveland closed 4 months later. Russ made a profit, not a windfall, but solid. He paid me back according to the schedule, every installment on time. He sent a paper check each time, which I thought was deliberate, some old-fashioned way of making the gesture more concrete. I still work. I'm not sure I'll ever fully stop. Cascade has 31 employees now. We've expanded into preventive maintenance contracts with some of the larger hospital networks in the state, which is steady work that doesn't care much about market cycles. My accountant says I could sell the company for a number that would surprise people. I don't think about that often. What I think about is this. I think about the drive home from Millhaven that Thanksgiving night when I was 54, the radio on, the fields dark on either side of the highway, and Carolee's voice on the phone asking how it went. I think about May carrying that pie through Vera's front door. I think about Tucker inside of 90 Seconds, finding the TV. I think about my brother standing by the window, looking at a life he decided didn't exist, and finding out quietly that it had been there the whole time. Some things don't need to be announced. They just need to be real. And this was real. I've thought about that Thanksgiving a lot since then. Not the part where Russ said what he said. I stopped replaying that years ago. What I think about more is what I didn't do. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I just picked up my plate and moved to the kitchen, and that choice, quiet as it was, said more about who I'd become than anything I could have spoken out loud. There's something that happens when you spend enough years building something real. You stop needing to explain it. Russ needed the room to agree with him. I didn't need the room at all. That's not a small difference. That's the whole distance between a man who's still performing and a man who's already arrived somewhere. People talk about hard work like it's only about hours logged or money earned. But the kind of work I'm talking about goes deeper than that. It's about the decision, made quietly and over again, to keep going when nobody's watching, to get better at something not because it impresses anyone, but because the craft itself deserves it. Every early morning, every crawl space, every midnight phone call from a restaurant manager panicking about a walk-in cooler, I showed up because the work was mine and I respected it. That consistency, held over decades, has a way of compounding into something nobody can take from you. What Russ never understood, what I don't think he was built to understand, at least not back then, is that restraint is not the same thing as weakness. I knew things about my own life that he didn't. I had Carolee. I had May and Tucker. I had May and Tucker. I had a company that 31 people depended on. I chose not to hand him that information, not because I was ashamed of it, but because I refused to let him be the judge of it. That refusal took more strength than any argument I could have started. You don't always win by fighting. Sometimes you win by deciding the fight was never worth having. And the sharp part, the part that stays with me, is that Russ came to me anyway. Not because I'd proven anything to him publicly, but because the truth of what I'd built was simply there, waiting, when he needed it. You can't argue with a conference table full of trucks parked outside the window. He walked into that office and the evidence was already present. I didn't have to say a word. What I did do, and I think this mattered, was help him. Not completely. Not in a way that let him avoid the discomfort of figuring things out himself. I gave him a structure, a fair deal, a path forward. Because whatever Russ had said to me over the years, he was still my brother, and I was not going to let his mistakes become my bitterness. When May carried that pie through Vera's front door and my aunt crossed the room with both hands out, that was the moment I felt it most clearly. Not victory. Something quieter than that. Just rightness. The life I protected by keeping it private was finally standing in a room full of people, completely intact, asking for nothing and needing no one's approval to exist. That's all I ever wanted it to be.